The mountains of the Jura rose up behind the town like the back of a watch case, and in the winter the light came late and left early, and the boy who was not yet called Le Corbusier sat at a workbench with the loupe pressed to his eye, learning to engrave the smallest possible flowers onto surfaces no larger than a thumbnail. This was La Chaux-de-Fonds, a town in the Swiss mountains where nearly everyone made watches or made the cases that held them, where precision was not a virtue but a condition of employment, and where Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, born in 1887, was being trained to continue a trade that had shaped the town's economy and its sense of itself for generations. The work required a steady hand and an eye for minute geometries. It required patience and the ability to see beauty in reduction, in the distillation of a rose or a leaf into its essential lines. He was good at it, and he hated it. Or perhaps he did not hate it exactly. Perhaps what he felt was something closer to impatience, the sense that the scale was wrong, that there was something absurd about spending one's life carving invisible ornaments onto the backs of tiny machines. But the discipline stayed with him. The watchmaker's attention to proportion, to the relationship between the smallest part and the whole, to the idea that beauty could be engineered rather than improvised, these would remain long after he abandoned the loupe and the engraving tools. La Chaux-de-Fonds itself was a kind of lesson. The town had burned to the ground in 1794 and been rebuilt on a strict grid, the streets running straight and wide, the blocks uniform, the whole settlement organized according to a rational plan that prioritized light and air and the efficient movement of goods and people. It was one of the first planned towns in Europe, and the boy who would grow up to dream of raising Paris and rebuilding it as a forest of towers had spent his childhood in a place that had already done something similar to itself and survived. His family was not wealthy, but neither were they poor. His father was an enameler, another trade in the watch industry, and his mother was a musician, a piano teacher with firm opinions about art and culture and the proper way to raise children. She was ambitious for her sons, and she had a particular vision of what cultivation meant. It involved discipline, cleanliness, an appreciation for the mountains, and a suspicion of anything too decorative or sentimental. There was a certain Protestant rigor in the household, a belief that beauty should be earned through clarity and restraint, and this too stayed with him. He grew up in a town where making things was the central fact of life, where craftsmanship was assumed, where the question was not whether you would work with your hands, but what you would make and how well you would make it. And he grew up in a landscape that seemed designed to teach lessons about verticality and horizontality, about the difference between the heavy stone base and the open sky, about light and shadow and the way a single white plane could hold the sun. At the age of 13.5, he enrolled in the local art school, the École d'Art, to study engraving and the decorative arts. The director of the school was a man named Charles Leplatinier, and he was something of a visionary, or at least he thought of himself that way. Leplatinier believed that decoration should be rooted in nature, that students should go into the mountains and the forests and study the forms they found there, and that the future of the decorative arts lay in a kind of stylized naturalism that owed something to Art Nouveau but stripped it of its excess. He called his approach the high art of decoration, and he pushed his students to think beyond the watch case, to imagine themselves as architects or artists or designers of entire environments. Jeanneret absorbed this with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for permission to think larger thoughts. He made studies of pine trees and ferns, reducing them to patterns, to repeating geometries. He learned to draw with precision, to see the underlying structure of things, to translate the organic into the geometric without losing the sense of life. And he began to dream of architecture, even though he had no formal training in it, even though at this point he had barely left his hometown. Leplatinier arranged for him to take his first commission while he was still a teenager. A local engraver wanted a house built, and Leplatinier convinced him that his young student could design it. Jeanneret was 18 years old. He had never designed a building. He had no training in structure or construction, no understanding of how buildings stood up or how rooms connected to one another, but he had a good eye and a willingness to work, and he had the confidence of someone who did not yet know what he did not know. The house he designed was called the Villa Follett, and it was completed in 1906, a year after he began working on it. It was a chalet in the local style, heavy and ornamental, with carved wooden details and a steep roof and decorative motifs drawn from the surrounding forest. It looked nothing like the buildings he would design 20 years later. It was everything he would come to despise: fussy, regionalist, weighed down by decoration. But it was also competent, and it was built, and it taught him that architecture was something he could do. He left Le Chaux-de-Fonds soon after. Le Platinier had given him a piece of advice that would shape the next several years of his life. If you want to be an architect, go and look at buildings. And so Jeanneret set off on what would become a series of journeys, a self-directed education that took him across Europe and into North Africa, a grand tour undertaken without wealth or connections but with a notebook and a camera and an appetite for seeing. He went first to Italy in 1907, spending months in Florence and Venice and Rome, drawing and photographing and trying to understand how the Renaissance architects had thought about proportion and mass and the relationship between a building and its site. He was particularly struck by the Charterhouse of Ema, a monastery in Tuscany where the monks lived in individual cells arranged around a central courtyard, each cell with its own small garden, the whole complex organized to balance solitude and community, enclosure and openness. He would return to this model again and again in his later work, the idea of the individual dwelling as a cell in a larger collective structure, the monastery as a prototype for modern housing. From Italy he went to Vienna and then to Paris, where he arrived in 1908 with almost no money and a letter of introduction to Auguste Perret, one of the pioneering architects working in reinforced concrete. Perret hired him, and for the next 14 months Jeanneret worked in his studio, learning how concrete could be used not as a substitute for stone, but as a material with its own structural and aesthetic possibilities. Concrete could span greater distances, could support floors without the need for load-bearing walls, could be poured into molds to create forms that would have been impossible in masonry. Perret was building apartment buildings and churches that expressed this structural logic, that celebrated the concrete frame rather than hiding it behind traditional facades. Jeanneret absorbed this, like someone learning a new language. He began to understand that architecture could be something other than decoration, applied to mass, that it could be the expression of structure, that the way a building stood up could be the same as the way it looked. He traveled next to Germany, where he spent several months in 1910 and 1911 working in the office of Peter Behrens in Berlin. Behrens was the architect and industrial designer for AEG, the German electrical company, and he was attempting to create a unified visual identity for a modern corporation, designing everything from factories to light fixtures to typefaces. The office was a kind of laboratory for a new kind of practice, one that sought to integrate art and industry, beauty and function. While Jeanneret was there, so were two other young architects who would go on to shape the century, Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. It is strange to think of them all in the same room, these three men who would become the trinity of modernist architecture, all of them still in their 20s, all of them still trying to figure out what it meant to design for an age of machines and mass production. Behrens' office was rigorous, intellectual, focused on systems and standards. Jeanneret learned about industrial production, about the need for standardized components, about the idea that design could operate at every scale from the teaspoon to the city. But the real transformation came during his journey to the East in 1911. He set out with a friend, August Klippstein, on a trip that would take them through the Balkans and Greece and Turkey, ending in Italy before he returned to Switzerland. They traveled slowly, mostly by train and by foot, and Jeanneret filled notebook after notebook with drawings and observations. He was particularly overwhelmed by his encounter with the Parthenon in Athens. He spent days on the Acropolis, measuring, drawing, photographing, trying to understand how the building achieved its sense of perfect proportion, how it seemed both monumental and weightless, how it sat on its site, as if it had grown there. He became convinced that the Parthenon was not just a beautiful building, but a kind of equation, a proof that beauty could be the result of mathematical relationships, that form could be disciplined by number and still remain deeply moving. This was a revelation that would stay with him. The idea that architecture could be both rational and transcendent, that precision and emotion were not opposites. From Greece they traveled to Istanbul, where he saw the Byzantine churches and mosques, the way light entered through high windows and transformed the interior space into something immaterial. He was struck by the whitewashed houses of the Greek islands, by their simplicity and their brilliance in the sun, by the way they seemed to reduce architecture to its essentials: walls, windows, flat roofs, the play of light and shadow. These images lodged in his imagination. Years later, when he was designing villas in Paris, when he was arguing for white buildings stripped of ornament, when he was insisting that architecture should be pure form modeled by light, he was remembering the Aegean, the way a white cube could hold the sky. He returned to La Chaux-de-Fonds in late 1911, and over the next several years he designed a series of houses there, each one a step away from the regional style of the Villa Fallet and towards something more austere and geometric. The Villa Jeanneret-Perret, which he designed for his parents in 1912, was a white box with a flat roof and large windows, almost shockingly plain by the standards of the town. It looked more Greek than Swiss, and the neighbors were not sure what to make of it. He was beginning to develop a visual language of his own, one that drew on what he had seen in his travels, the whitewashed vernacular of the Mediterranean, the structural clarity of Perret's concrete, the proportional discipline of the Parthenon, but he was doing so in isolation, without an audience or a critical context that could make sense of what he was attempting. He taught for a while at the École d'Art, where Lepsaunier still presided, but the relationship soured. Jeanneret was moving in a direction his old teacher did not understand or approve of, and by 1917 the two had broken contact. The war years were frustrating. Switzerland was neutral, and Jeanneret spent them working on small projects and theoretical studies, increasingly convinced that the future of architecture lay not in individual villas, but in mass housing, in the application of industrial methods to the problem of shelter. He was reading Le Corbusier, a novel by a forgotten writer whose protagonist had the same name, and he liked the sound of it, liked the way it suggested something both ancient and modern, something French and therefore cosmopolitan. He had not yet taken the name, but he was preparing to. In 1917 he moved to Paris, and this time it was permanent. He was 30 years old. He had designed a handful of buildings, none of them particularly well known, and he had no clear path forward. But he had ideas, and he had ambition, and he had a sense that the old world, the world of masonry and ornament and craft, tradition, was finished, that the war had destroyed it, as surely as it had destroyed the old political order, and that it was time to build something entirely new. In Paris he met Amédée Ozenfant, a painter who had developed a theory called purism, a reaction against the perceived chaos of cubism. Ozenfant believed that art had become too subjective, too fragmented, that it needed to return to clear forms and universal principles. He and Jeanneret began collaborating, painting together and writing manifestos, and in 1918 they published a book called Après le Cubisme, a polemic that called for a new art based on geometry, clarity, and the elimination of anything decorative or sentimental. Jeanneret began signing his paintings Le Corbusier, and gradually the name migrated to his architectural work as well. It was a reinvention, a way of shedding the provincial past and claiming a place in the Parisian avant-garde. Le Corbusier sounded like a lineage, like a name that had always existed, and in a way it allowed him to become someone else, someone who had not spent his youth engraving watch cases in the Swiss mountains. In 1920 he and Ozenfant launched a journal called L'Esprit Nouveau, a magazine devoted to modern art, architecture, and design. It ran for 28 issues over 5 years, and it became the platform through which Le Corbusier developed and disseminated his architectural theories. He wrote prolifically, often under pseudonyms, filling the pages with essays on urbanism, housing, industrial design, and the aesthetics of the machine age. He was teaching himself to write, to argue, to provoke, and he discovered that he was good at it, that he had a gift for the memorable phrase, the striking image, the polemical overstatement that would lodge in the reader's mind. It was in the pages of L'Esprit Nouveau that he first declared that a house is a machine for living in, a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life, that would be endlessly quoted and misunderstood and used against him by people who thought he wanted to turn homes into factories. What he meant, or what he thought he meant, was that a house should be designed with the same attention to function and efficiency as an engineer designing an airplane or a car, that it should be stripped of unnecessary ornament and organized around the needs of its inhabitants, that it should take advantage of modern materials and construction techniques to create spaces that were healthier and more rational than the dark, cramped apartments of the 19th century city. But the phrase also revealed something about his temperament, his attraction to the language of engineering, his belief that the machine was not a threat to human life, but a model for it. He published photographs of grain silos and ocean liners and factories alongside images of the Parthenon, arguing that these industrial structures possessed a kind of unconscious beauty, that they had been shaped by necessity and function into forms that were as elegant as anything in the history of architecture. He was trying to create a genealogy for modern architecture, to show that it was not a break with the past, but a continuation of a deeper tradition, one that had always valued clarity and proportion and the honest expression of structure. In 1922, he and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, who was also an architect, opened a studio together in Paris. They would work in partnership for the next 2 decades, and though the buildings would be credited to Le Corbusier, much of the design work and all of the technical detailing was done by Pierre, who was quieter, more patient, more interested in solving problems than in making pronouncements. Their first significant project was the Maison La Roche-Jeanneret, a pair of houses built in 1923 and 1924 in the 16th arrondissement, for 2 clients, a Swiss banker named Raoul Laroche and Le Corbusier's brother Albert. The houses were white, flat-roofed, and organized around a complex interlocking of interior spaces with ramps and double-height galleries and walls that curved and planned to create a sense of spatial flow. They were purist buildings, severe and geometric, but they were also surprisingly sensual, the way the light moved through them, the way the spaces opened and contracted, the way the interior promenade led you through a sequence of carefully composed views. The Maison La Roche included a gallery for the banker's collection of purist and cubist paintings, and the building was designed to be experienced as a kind of spatial journey, a promenade architecturale that unfolded over time as you moved through it. This idea that a building should be understood not as a static composition, but as a sequence of spaces and views revealed through movement, became central to Le Corbusier's conception of architecture. It was an idea that had roots in his memory of the Acropolis, the way you approached the Parthenon along a diagonal path, the building revealing itself in stages, never all at once. He wanted his buildings to have the same quality, to be experienced cinematically, as a series of unfolding frames. During these years, he was also painting every morning before the architectural work began. The paintings were still lifes mostly, arrangements of bottles and glasses and guitars and other everyday objects, rendered in flat planes of muted color. He called the objects type objects, things that had been refined by use and production into their essential forms. A wine bottle, a pipe, a seashell, these were not arbitrary shapes, but forms that had been perfected, that represented a kind of industrial or natural selection. He was looking for a visual language that could express this sense of inevitability, this idea that there were right forms and wrong forms, that beauty was not a matter of taste but of correctness. The paintings were exercises in proportion and composition, and they were also meditations on the same themes that preoccupied him in architecture: reduction, clarity, the search for essential forms. He was not a great painter, and he knew it. But the practice disciplined his eye, taught him to see relationships, to understand how a composition could be balanced without being symmetrical, how a small shift in proportion could make a form feel either stable or unstable. In 1923 he published a book called Vers national, Architecture, which was later translated into English as Towards a New Architecture. It was part manifesto, part history, part catalogue of images, and it became one of the most influential architectural texts of the 20th century. The book collected many of the essays he had written for L'Esprit Nouveau, refining and expanding them into a sustained argument for a new kind of architecture, one that embraced the machine age, that learned from engineers, that sought to create a visual language appropriate to modern life. He illustrated the book with photographs of factories and bridges and cars and airplanes, juxtaposed with images of the Parthenon and Roman aqueducts, and he argued that all of these things shared a common aesthetic, that they all represented the triumph of function and necessity over decoration and caprice. The book also introduced his 5 points of architecture, a set of principles that would define his approach to building for the next decade. The 5 points were the pilettes, or columns that would lift the building off the ground and allow the landscape to flow beneath it; the free plan, made possible by the structural frame, which liberated the interior walls from any load-bearing function and allowed them to be arranged according to the needs of the program; the free facade, which followed from the free plan and allowed the exterior walls to be composed as independent screens rather than as structural elements; the horizontal window, which could run the length of the facade and flood the interior with light; and the roof garden, which would reclaim the ground arrow bekleid of Theldor space. These principles were not arbitrary. They represented a systematic rethinking of what a building could be, a shift from masonry construction, where the wall is both structure and enclosure, to frame construction, where the structure and the enclosure are separated, and this separation opens up new spatial and aesthetic possibilities. The 5 points were first fully realized in a series of villas he designed in the late 1920s, houses for wealthy clients in the suburbs of Paris. The Via Steindemunzi at Garches, completed in 1927, was a white rectangular block organized on a 9-square grid with spaces flowing into one another and a complex interpenetration of interior and exterior. The Villa Church at Ville d'Avray, begun in 1927 but not completed until 1929, had a curved garden facade and a roof terrace with views over the valley. These were experimental buildings, exercises in composition and proportion, and they were also houses where people actually lived, where light fell in certain ways at certain times of day, where you could stand at a window and look out at the trees, where the abstraction was always in dialogue with the particularities of a specific site and a specific set of lives. But the most perfect expression of the 5 points, the building that would come to stand for everything Le Corbusier believed architecture could be, was the Villa Savoy, designed in 1928 and completed in 1931. It was built for a wealthy couple, Pierre and Eugénie Savoy, on a large site in Poissy, a town about 30 kilometers west of Paris. The site was a gently sloping meadow surrounded by trees, and Le Corbusier placed the house in the center of the field, raised on pilettes, so that the ground plane remained uninterrupted, so that the meadow seemed to flow beneath the building as if it were barely touching the earth. The house was a white box, or nearly a box, with one side slightly curved, and it sat on a grid of slender cylindrical columns that raised it 3 meters off the ground. The ground floor was mostly open, a space for parking cars and for the entrance, which was not grand or formal, but almost casual, a curve of glazing that led into a vestibule and then to a ramp that rose through the center of the house. The main living spaces were on the first floor, one level up, arranged in an L shape around a terrace that was carved out of the volume of the box. The living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the guest rooms all opened onto this terrace, which was like an outdoor room. protected and private, open to the sky but enclosed by the walls of the house. The facade was a white, stucco skin stretched over the structural frame, and it was punctuated by horizontal ribbon windows that ran the length of the wall, uninterrupted by columns, divided only by thin mullions. The windows brought the landscape into the rooms, framed it, turned it into a series of views that changed as you moved through the house. The ramp, which rose from the ground floor to the first floor and then continued up to the roof terrace, was the spine of the composition, the element that organized the spatial sequence and gave the experience of the house a sense of direction and purpose. You were meant to move through the house slowly, to ascend the ramp and discover the rooms and the terraces and the views in a carefully choreographed order, to experience the building as a kind of narrative. The roof was a garden, as the 5 points required, with a solarium and a sculptural windscreen and space to walk and sit and lie in the sun. From the roof you could see the surrounding meadows and the trees and the distant hills, and the house seemed to frame and intensify the landscape rather than dominate it. There was a small stair that led from the roof down to the terrace on the first floor, creating a loop so that you could circulate continuously from the ground to the roof and back down, without retracing your steps. The Via Savoy was a demonstration, a proof of concept, a building that said, this is what architecture can be in the 20th century, this is what it looks like when you accept the logic of the machine age and use it to create spaces of openness and light and spatial complexity. It was a building about freedom, about the liberation of the plan from the tyranny of the load-bearing wall, about the possibility of creating a new relationship between inside and outside, between the building and the ground, between the human body and the landscape. It was also, though this was less often remarked upon at the time, a building about a particular kind of leisure, about the life of a wealthy family with a car and a chauffeur, and the time to take long, slow walks up a ramp through their own house on a Sunday afternoon. The Savoys did not live in the house for very long. There were problems with leaks, with heating, with the flat roof that did not drain properly and let water seep into the walls. They complained, and the Corbusier responded with irritation, suggesting that they were not sophisticated enough to understand what they had been given, that they did not know how to live in a modern house. The relationship deteriorated, and by the late 1930s the house was mostly abandoned. During the war it was occupied first by the Germans and then by the Allies, and it was damaged and neglected, and for years after the war it sat empty, crumbling, used as a barn for storing hay. It was almost demolished in the 1950s, but by then Le Corbusier had become famous, and the house had become an icon, and it was saved and eventually restored and turned into a museum. Today it is one of the most visited buildings in France, and it looks more or less as it did when it was finished, white and geometric and serene, a ghost of a future that never quite arrived. While he was designing villas for wealthy clients, Le Corbusier was also developing theories about housing for everyone else, for the masses, for the millions of people who lived in overcrowded slums in the cities of Europe and who needed new housing urgently. This was the paradox at the heart of his practice. He was designing palaces for the rich and dreaming of utopias for the poor, and he saw no contradiction. Or if he did, he thought the villas were research, prototypes that would eventually be adapted and standardized and mass-produced, that would become the model for a new kind of collective dwelling. In 1925, he exhibited a proposal called the Plan Voisin at the International Exposition of Decorative Arts in Paris. The Plan Voisin was a vision for the reconstruction of central Paris, and it was breathtaking in its ambition and its violence. He proposed demolishing most of the right bank, all of the dense fabric of streets and buildings north of the Seine, and replacing it with a grid of 18 identical cruciform skyscrapers, 60 stories tall, set in a park. The towers would house offices and apartments, and the ground plane would be given over to greenery and roads and pedestrian paths, and the city would be transformed from a medieval warren into a rational machine, a place of light and air and speed. The plan was not a serious proposal in the sense that it was never going to be built. It was an exhibition piece, a provocation, but it was also not a joke. Le Corbusier genuinely believed that the historical city was obsolete, that it was unhealthy and inefficient and aesthetically incoherent, that it needed to be replaced with something rational and modern. He believed that the tower in the park was the answer to the housing crisis, that by building up instead of out, by concentrating density vertically, you could free up land for parks and playgrounds, you could let sunlight reach every apartment, you could create a city that was both denser and greener than anything that had existed before. The plan Voisin was financed by an automobile company, and it was conceived as a city for cars, with wide avenues and highways running through the park with parking beneath the towers. Le Corbusier loved cars. He loved the speed, the mobility, the way they represented individual freedom and industrial precision. He thought the traditional street, with its mix of pedestrians and vehicles and commerce and housing, was a relic, that it needed to be replaced with a system that separated functions housing here, work there, recreation somewhere else, all connected by high-speed roads. This was the beginning of what would later be called the functional city, the idea that urban planning should be organized around the separation of land uses and the efficient movement of people and goods, an idea that would be codified in the Athens Charter of 1933 and implemented in cities all over the world in the decades after the Second World War, often with devastating results. He continued to develop these ideas through a series of proposals and manifestos. In 1922, he exhibited a project called the Contemporary City for 3 million inhabitants, another vision of towers in a park, and in 1930 he visited the Soviet Union and became involved, briefly, with the constructivist architects who were designing workers' housing and communal buildings for the new socialist state. He was attracted to the idea of collective living, to the notion that architecture could engineer a new kind of society. But he was also increasingly isolated from the left-wing architects who shared his formal language but not his politics. He was not a socialist. He was not really anything in particular politically except a believer in technocracy, in the idea that problems could be solved by experts, by rational planning, by the application of intelligence and will. In the 1930s, he sought commissions from authoritarian regimes, hoping that a strong centralized government might have the power to implement his urban visions where democracies had failed. He tried to get work from Mussolini in Italy, traveling to Rome and meeting with officials, proposing urban plans that were never built. He tried to get work in the Soviet Union, but the political winds shifted and the constructivist moment passed, and his proposals were rejected. When France fell to Germany in 1940, he stayed in Paris for a time and then moved to Vichy, where the collaborationist government had relocated, and he tried to position himself as an advisor, as someone who could plan the reconstruction of France after the war. He wrote articles, he submitted proposals, he tried to ingratiate himself with officials, and nothing came of it. After the war, this period would become a source of shame and controversy, something his defenders would minimize and his critics would not let him forget. The fact was that Le Corbusier's politics, such as they were secondary to his architecture, and his architecture was in service of a vision that was fundamentally authoritarian, even if he did not think of it that way. He believed that he knew how people should live, that he could design the right city, the right apartment, the right chair, and that once these designs were implemented, people would be happier and healthier and more rational. He did not spend much time asking people what they wanted. He did not believe that the accumulated wisdom of traditional cities, the informal order that emerged from thousands of individual decisions over centuries, had anything to teach him. He believed in the blank slate, in demolition and reconstruction, in the possibility of starting over. This was the central tension in his work, the thing that made it so powerful and so troubling. The buildings themselves, the best of them, were extraordinary, full of light and spatial invention, elegant and precise, and moving in ways that are hard to explain if you have not stood in them. But the urban theories that grew out of the same set of ideas led to some of the worst housing of the 20th century, to the high-rise projects that isolated people from the street and from each other, that segregated land uses and destroyed the vitality of mixed neighborhoods, that replaced complexity with simplicity, and ended up creating environments that were alienating and, often, dangerous. It is hard to say how much of this Le Corbusier understood. He spent the war years in Vichy and then in the Pyrenees, and he spent much of that time working on a project that seemed to have nothing to do with architecture at all. He was developing a proportional system he called the modular, a set of measurements based on the dimensions of the human body and the golden ratio, intended to provide architects with a universal scale, a set of harmonious dimensions that could be applied to everything from furniture to buildings to entire cities. It was an old dream, the dream of a universal language of form, and it was also a kind of retreat into abstraction, into the realm of pure number at a time when the world was falling apart and his own career was stalled and uncertain. The Modular was published in 1948, and it was received with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some saw it as a profound contribution, a tool that could restore proportion and harmony to modern design. Others saw it as a pseudo-scientific obsession, a numerological fantasy. Le Corbusier himself was convinced that it was one of his most important achievements, and he used the modular dimensions in all of his later buildings, inscribing the measurements on facades and in interior spaces, as if to prove that the buildings were not arbitrary compositions, but expressions of a deeper order. After the war, he was in his late 50s, and he had built relatively few buildings. The villas of the 20s were well known in architectural circles, and his writings had made him famous, but he had not yet had the opportunity to build at the scale he imagined, to realize his vision of mass housing and urban reconstruction. That changed in 1945, when he was invited to design a housing complex in Marseille. The Unité d'Habitation, completed in 1952, was an enormous housing block, a slab of raw concrete 18 stories tall, containing 337 apartments and designed to house 1,600 people. It was raised on pilettes, massive this time, sculptural and rough, and the building sat above the ground like a heavy box balanced on thick legs. The apartments were organized around a central corridor that ran the length of the building, with units on either side, some of them double height, interlocking like pieces of a puzzle, so that each apartment had a living room with a 2-story ceiling and a sleeping mezzanine. The facade was a grid of balconies, each apartment with its own outdoor space, the whole building textured with the rhythm of projecting boxes and deep shadows. Halfway up the building there was a shopping street, an internal corridor with shops and services, and on the roof there was a garden, a running track, a shallow pool for children, and a sculptural landscape of ventilation stacks and stairwells. The Unité was conceived as a vertical village, a building that would contain all the functions of a small town housing, shopping, education, recreation, so that the residents would not need to leave except to go to work. It was Le Corbusier's monastery in the air, the realization of an idea that had been with him since he visited the charter house of Ima 40 years earlier, the idea that you could create a collective dwelling that balanced individual privacy and communal life. The building was raw and massive and strange. The concrete was left unfinished, board-marked, the texture of the wooden formwork imprinted on the surface, and this was a radical shift from the smooth white villas of the 20s. Le Corbusier called it béton brut, raw concrete, and the term would later be borrowed to describe an entire movement, brutalism, which took the Unité as its foundational text. The building was not pretty in the conventional sense. It was monumental, sculptural, oppressive to some and inspiring to others. It divided opinion sharply. Traditionalists hated it, thought it was an affront to the city and to the idea of what housing should look like. Modernists celebrated it as a breakthrough, a building that proved you could house large numbers of people with dignity and invention, that you could make collective housing beautiful. The residents had mixed feelings. Some loved it, loved the sense of community, the convenience of the shops and services, the light in the apartments, the views from the roof. Others found it isolating, found that the corridor was dark and institutional, that the idea of a vertical village did not quite work in practice, that people did not use the shopping street as much as Le Corbusier had imagined, that they preferred to go into the city, to shop and socialize in the traditional way. The building required maintenance, and over time the concrete weathered and stained, the services declined, and the Unité came to look more like a monument to a failed future than a prototype for mass housing. But other cities wanted one. Le Corbusier was invited to design unités in other parts of France, in Berlin, in Briey-en-Fouille, in Firminy, and these were built, though none of them had quite the impact of the first. And the form of the Unité tower in the park, the slab block raised on pilettes, the separation of housing from the street, was copied, simplified, stripped of Le Corbusier's spatial invention and sculptural attention, and built by the thousands in the post-war housing estates of Europe and America. The results were often disastrous. The towers were built too quickly, too cheaply, without the internal streets and roof gardens and double-height living rooms that made the Unité interesting. They were placed in windswept plazas with no relation to the surrounding city, and they became symbols of urban failure, of the arrogance of modernist planning, of the damage that can be done when architects impose their visions on people who have no say in the matter. This was the tragedy of Le Corbusier's urban theories. They were elegant on paper, and they were compelling to planners and politicians who were desperate to solve the housing crisis, but they were implemented in ways that he would have disavowed, and they caused real harm. The housing projects of Paris and London and Chicago and St. Louis were built in his name, but they were also betrayals of his ideas, caricatures that took the form without the substance, the tower without the garden, the slab without the spatial richness, the separation of functions without the offsetting provision of communal life. He kept working. In the 1950s, he was invited to design the new capital of the Punjab in Chandigarh, India, a city that was being built from scratch after the partition of India and Pakistan had left the region without an administrative center. It was the commission he had been waiting for his entire life, the chance to design not just buildings, but an entire city, to implement his urban theories at full scale. He designed the master plan, a grid of sectors organized around a hierarchy of roads with separate zones for housing, work, and recreation, and he designed the major government buildings, the High Court, the Secretariat, the Assembly, which were grouped together in a monumental precinct at the head of the city. The buildings in Chandigarh were unlike anything he had designed before. They were made of raw concrete, like the Unité, but they were more sculptural, more expressive, with deep overhangs and brise soleils to protect against the sun, and with forms that were monumental and strange. The High Court had a canopy like an umbrella, supported on massive columns, and the interior was a soaring space, filled with colored light filtered through panels of glass. The Assembly had a cooling tower shaped like a hyperbolic paraboloid, a form he had been experimenting with, and a portico with columns that leaned outward at an angle, defying the usual logic of structure. The buildings were powerful and idiosyncratic, and they represented a shift in his work, a move away from the machine aesthetic of the 20s and towards something more sculptural and elemental, something that responded to the heat and the light and the culture of the place where they were built. Chandigarh was also, like so many of his urban projects, a partial failure. The master plan was too rigid, the sectors too large, the roads too wide, the separation of functions too extreme. The city was designed for a certain vision of modern life, for cars, and for a kind of spaciousness that did not match the way people actually lived. The poor could not afford cars, and they ended up walking long distances along roads that had no sidewalks, no shade, no sense of human scale. The housing was not built according to Le Corbusier's designs, but according to cheaper, simplified versions, and much of it was mediocre. The government buildings were magnificent, but they were isolated in their precinct, cut off from the rest of the city, more like monuments than like places where people worked. Over time, Chandigarh became a real city, with informal markets and shops and alterations that softened the rigidity of the plan. But it was a city that succeeded despite Le Corbusier's planning as much as because of it. While he was working on Chandigarh, he was also designing a chapel in Reshaped, a pilgrimage site in eastern France. The chapel of Notre Dame du Haut, completed in 1955, was unlike anything he had designed before, and it shocked the architectural world. It was a sculptural object, a building that seemed to have been carved rather than constructed, with thick curving walls and a roof that swooped upward like a sail or a nun's habit, and with small windows punched irregularly through the walls, each window lined with colored glass that threw pools of red and yellow and blue light into the dim interior. Reshaped was not rational. It was not based on the 5 points or the modular or any of the theories he had spent decades developing. It was expressive, emotional, almost mystical, and it seemed to suggest that Le Corbusier had abandoned his earlier convictions, that he had given up on the machine aesthetic and embraced something more intuitive and personal. His critics accused him of betraying modernism, of pandering to irrationalism, of becoming sentimental in his old age. His defenders argued that the chapel was a logical extension of his work, that it showed his ability to respond to the specific demands of a site and a program, that there was no contradiction between the rationalism of the villas and the expressionism of Reshaped, that both were attempts to create architecture that moved people. The truth was probably that Le Corbusier had always been more complicated than his rhetoric suggested, that the villas were never as coldly rational as they appeared, and that Reshaped was not as irrational as it seemed. The chapel was full of geometric control, full of carefully calibrated proportions, and the apparently random placement of the windows was in fact the result of painstaking study. But the surface had changed. The smooth white plains of the 20s had given way to rough concrete and thick walls and forms that seemed to belong to an older, more archaic tradition. And this shift was part of a larger transformation in his work in the 50s and 60s, a move toward the monumental and the sculptural, toward buildings that looked less like machines and more like objects carved from the earth. He continued to paint every morning. The paintings had become more colorful, more gestural, less rigidly geometric. He painted images of women, of bulls, of hands, and the paintings had a roughness, a kind of clumsiness even, that was oddly appealing. He was not trying to be a great painter anymore, if he ever had been. He was using the paintings to think through ideas, to work out formal relationships, and he exhibited them regularly, and they sold, though mostly to people who were more interested in owning a Le Corbusier than in owning a good painting. In the late 50s, he designed a monastery, Saint-Marie de la Tourette, in a forest near Lyon. It was a building for Dominican monks, and it was organized around the same principles as the charter house of Ima, the same balance of solitude and community. The monks lived in individual cells arranged along corridors, and the communal spaces, the chapel, the refectory, the library, were at the base of the building. The building was made of raw concrete, and it had the same rough, archaic quality as Reshaped and Chandigarh, the same sense of weight and permanence. The chapel was a tall, narrow space, lit by narrow slots of colored light, and it had an intensity, a severity, that was almost overwhelming. It was a building for silence, for contemplation, for a life stripped of everything inessential. La Tourette was one of his last great buildings. He continued to work through the 60s, designing projects in Japan and South America and Europe, but many of them were not built or were completed only after his death, or were compromised in ways that disappointed him. He was in his 70s, and he was tired, and he was increasingly bitter about the fact that so few of his urban projects had been realized, that his visions for cities had been copied in the worst possible ways, that he was blamed for housing developments he had not designed and would never have approved. In 1952, he had built a small cabin for himself at Roque Brun Cap Martin, a village on the Mediterranean coast near the Italian border. The cabin was tiny, only 15 square meters, a single room with a bed, a table, a few shelves, and nothing else. It was raised on a wooden platform, and it looked out over the sea. The cabin was a reduction, a return to essentials, and it was based on the modular, every dimension calculated according to the proportional system he had spent so many years developing. He spent part of every summer there painting and swimming and thinking, and he loved it with an intensity that seemed to surprise even him. This tiny, austere dwelling with no running water and no electricity was the opposite of the grand urban visions he had spent his life promoting, and yet it was also entirely consistent with them, because it was about the same thing, the search for the essential, for the minimum, for the right way to live. On the morning of August 27, 1965, he went for a swim in the sea near the cabin. He was 77 years old, and he had been told by doctors not to swim alone, but he ignored them. He entered the water, and he did not come back. His body was found floating a short distance from the shore. It is not clear what happened. A heart attack, a stroke, a cramp. He drowned in the sea he loved, near the cabin that was perhaps the purest expression of his architectural philosophy, a building that contained only what was necessary and nothing more. His death was reported around the world, and the tributes were elaborate and conflicted. He was called a genius, a visionary, the greatest architect of the century. He was also called a monster, a destroyer of cities, a man whose beautiful ideas had led to ugly realities. Both things were true, and they remain true. The buildings he designed, the Savoye, Ronchamp, La Tourette, the Unité are among the most important and most moving works of 20th century architecture. They are buildings that repay attention, that reveal more each time you visit them, that demonstrate the possibility of architecture as an art, as something that can be both rational and poetic, both precise and moving. But the cities that were built in his name, the housing projects and urban highways and tower blocks that took his formal language and stripped it of its nuance and its care, these caused real damage, and the damage is still visible. The question of how much responsibility he bears for this is not simple. He did not design those projects, and he often disavowed them, but he also created the intellectual framework that made them possible, and he promoted his urban theories with a rhetorical force that overrode objections and doubts. He believed that he was right, and he believed that the world would be better if it was rebuilt according to his principles, and he did not spend much time thinking about what might be lost in the process. In the decades after his death, his reputation went through cycles. In the 70s and 80s, as the failures of modernist urban planning became undeniable, as the housing projects were demolished or abandoned, as cities began to value their old neighborhoods and historic fabric, Le Corbusier became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, the architect whose arrogance and abstraction had produced so much misery. The critique was not entirely fair, but it was not entirely unfair either. The postmodern architects who emerged in the 70s defined themselves in opposition to him, rejecting his rationalism, his universalism, his belief in the possibility of a single right answer. But by the 90s and 2000s, there was a reassessment. A new generation of architects and critics began to look at the buildings themselves rather than the theories, and they found that the buildings were far more complex and more humane than the caricature suggested. They noticed the spatial richness, the way light moved through the interiors, the care given to proportion and detail, the way even the most austere buildings created moments of beauty and surprise. They began to argue that the problem was not Le Corbusier's ideas, but the way those ideas had been misunderstood and misapplied. that there was a difference between the unité d'habitation and the housing projects built by bureaucrats and developers who cared nothing for architecture, who took the form and ignored the content. This argument is also not entirely fair. Le Corbusier's urban theories were genuinely problematic, genuinely naive about the complexity of cities and the importance of incremental organic growth. He really did believe in demolition and reconstruction, in the blank slate, in the idea that the past was a burden to be shed. But the buildings, the best of them, are something else. They are works of art, and like all works of art, they are irreducible to the theories that generated them. Via Savoy is not a treatise on the 5 points. It is a building, a place, a specific arrangement of space and light and material that you can walk through and stand in and experience. And when you do, it is difficult not to be moved, difficult not to recognize that something remarkable happened here, that this person, with all his contradictions and his hubris, was capable of making things of extraordinary beauty. The small cabin at Cap Martin is now a museum, and you can visit it, though you have to book in advance, and the visits are brief. It is almost shocking how small it is, how austere, how little there is. A bed, a table, a shelf for books, a window that opens to the sea. The walls are covered with murals he painted, simple shapes and figures in bright colors, a kind of decoration that seems both childlike and deeply considered. The cabin was registered as a historic monument, and it stands as a kind of counterpoint to the grand projects, the towers and the cities and the monuments. It suggests that maybe what he was looking for all along was not the city of 3 million inhabitants, or the tower in the park, but this, a single room, a place of perfect proportion, a shelter that contains only what is necessary and opens to the world. His influence is still everywhere. The glass-walled office buildings, the pilettes that lift buildings above parking lots, the ribbon windows, the flat roofs, the open-plan apartments, the separation of structure and enclosure, the idea that a building can be a machine, precise and efficient and beautiful, these are all, in one way or another, his legacy. But so are the towers in the park, the demolished neighborhoods, the urban highways, the housing projects that have been dynamited because they became unlivable. He is responsible for both, or at least he is implicated in both, and there is no way to separate the beauty from the damage. Late in his life he wrote that architecture was the learned game, correct and magnificent of forms assembled in the light. It was a beautiful sentence, one he repeated often, and it was true, at least for him. He loved form, loved the way buildings could be composed, loved the discipline and the precision and the search for the right proportion, the right relationship. But the game had consequences, and the forms were not assembled in a vacuum. They were assembled in cities, in neighborhoods, in places where people lived, and when the forms were wrong, or when they were imposed without care, they caused suffering. This is the lesson, if there is one, of Le Corbusier's life and work. That beauty is real, that it matters, that architecture can be an art of the highest order, but also that beauty is not enough, that buildings exist in the world, and the world is complicated, and the consequences of what we build are real and lasting, and cannot be wished away by theory or by rhetoric, no matter how seductive. The white villas of the 20s are still there, most of them, some restored, some still in private hands. Via Savoy still sits in its meadow, looking like it was built yesterday, looking like it came from a future that never arrived. The Unité in Marseille still houses families, still has its shopping street and its roof terrace, though it is shabby now, worn, a relic of a different era. Ronchamp is still a place of pilgrimage, and La Tourette is still a monastery, though there are fewer monks now, and the building is also a conference center, a place for architects to visit and study. Chandigarh is a city of more than 1 million people, and it has grown beyond Le Corbusier's plan, sprawled and adapted, and become something he would not have recognized, but the great government buildings are still there, massive and strange and beautiful, monuments to an idea of modernity that has not entirely faded, even if it no longer commands the faith it once did. And the cabin at Cap Martin is still there, that tiny room overlooking the sea, the place where he was happiest, where everything was reduced to the essential, where the vision was not of a city or a tower, but of a single human body at rest, looking out at the water, surrounded by light.